They never wanted you to hear this part of American history. It was never meant for sermons, for schoolbooks, or even for the whispered gossip of small-town Utah. Because what happened to Mr. Ezekiel Whitmore and his 4 wives in the winter of 1847 does not fit inside the version of history you've been taught to believe. And if you listen closely, you might begin to understand why the men who wrote that history locked the truth away for over 70 years. Imagine it snow covering the Utah territory like a burial shroud. No sound but the wind gnawing at the log cabins. Isolation so complete that even your own footsteps feel like trespassing. In a small, lonely clearing 8 miles from the nearest settlement, a man lives with 4 wives not in defiance of his faith, but under the secret blessing of it. Their home, freshly built, stands like a fortress against the winter, and yet something inside those walls is already rotting. In December, witnesses see the women alive smiling politely, their movements eerily synchronized, their words careful, measured, as if rehearsed. Weeks later, they're gone. All of them. No footprints in the snow. No wagons leaving. No messages. Only a husband whose explanations change every time he opens his mouth. The church records at the time? Sanitized. The bishop's official journal? Omitted. But in his private diary, the one never meant for any other eyes are words that cut through the facade. They moved like one mind in 4 bodies and each bore the same mark upon the wrist. He didn't believe they left willingly. And he wasn't alone. For decades, the story was whispered, not told. For wives vanishing in the dead of winter, erased from sermons, erased from public archives, preserved only in the vaults where the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints keeps its most dangerous secrets. Until 1920, when men building a new meeting house struck something buried beneath its foundation. And when they uncovered it, the elders could no longer pretend this chapter didn't exist. I'm going to take you down into that darkness, into the forbidden corners of Utah's past where faith, fear, and power collided and left behind something no one could explain away. But once you hear it, you won't come back the same. To understand why Ezekiel Whitmore's case was so dangerous to the men who built Zion, you need to understand the year 1847 in Utah Territory. This was not the romantic pioneer tale carved into textbooks. This was a closed society, forged by exile, wrapped in secrecy, and ruled by leaders who believed they were building the kingdom of God on earth at any cost. When Brigham Young first stood in the Salt Lake Valley and declared, "This is the place," he wasn't just choosing a home. He was choosing a prison, a place so isolated by mountains and desert that the only way in was through him. This was the genius and the danger. Cut off from the outside world, the settlement could live by its own rules, and those rules were enforced as much by fear as by faith. Into this came Ezekiel Whitmore, a Vermont-born carpenter, converted in Nauvoo under Joseph Smith himself. A man who understood building things and a man who understood obedience. But Ezekiel brought something unusual with him. Not 1 wife, not 2 but 4. Sarah, Rebecca, Mary, and Ruth. 4 women, each with a different history, different temperament. And yet by the winter of 47 they seemed to operate as if sharing the same heartbeat. Visitors wrote of their perfect harmony, but one bishop saw something far more unsettling. Eyes that didn't quite match the smiles on their faces, hands marked with identical, deliberate cuts, and a silence that felt cultivated. Here's the detail that never makes it into the children's versions of Mormon pioneer history. Plural marriage in those days wasn't just about belief, it was about control. Every wife's role, every movement, every word could be monitored, regulated, and corrected. In isolation, under the weight of long winters, that control could become total. By December 19th, they were still alive. 2 of them spoke to hunters at the door. A week later, Ezekiel appeared in the main settlement looking like he'd aged 10 years, claiming Sarah had received a revelation to travel east in the dead of winter. The bishop knew it was impossible. There were no travelers, no safe routes, and Sarah had no sister in Missouri. This was the first fracture in the facade, but it wouldn't be the last. Over the next 6 weeks, Ezekiel would return with stranger and stranger explanations until one night, a man staying in that cabin swore he heard muffled weeping coming from beneath the floor. What happened under that cabin would become one of the most suppressed stories in the territory's history. And when you hear it, you'll understand why. By late January 1848, Ezekiel's stories had unraveled into something even the most loyal church elders couldn't keep straight. First, Sarah had gone east. Then Rebecca. Then, weeks later, both Mary and Ruth had supposedly joined them, for departures in less than 2 months, all in the deadliest winter the Utah Territory had yet seen, and all without witnesses, without letters, without so much as a borrowed wagon. Bishop William Curtis knew something was wrong. He knew it in the way Ezekiel avoided eye contact, in the way his voice cracked when pressed for details, and in the way he recoiled at the suggestion of a visit. But the bishop also knew the cost of making his suspicions public. In 1848, the Mormon settlements were under intense scrutiny from the U.S. government. Any whisper of impropriety, especially within a plural household, could bring agents, soldiers, and journalists storming into the valley. So, for weeks, he watched, listened, waited, until one February morning when Ezekiel made his third appearance at the settlement gaunt, pale and talking in circles about God's mysterious ways. This time, Curtis didn't ask for permission. He gathered 5 men, armed and silent, and led them through the snow toward Mill Creek. The wind was a living thing that day, shoving against them, screaming through the pines. When they reached the Whitmore cabin, the first thing they noticed was the silence. No voices, no movement, no sounds of domestic life, just the faint hiss of a fire too small for the size of the room. Ezekiel greeted them with brittle courtesy, his eyes darting to the back wall as if something waited there. When Curtis demanded to see the wives' belongings, Ezekiel opened the doors to 4 bare rooms. Clothes, books, small personal treasures all gone. Heavy furniture and cooking tools, still there. Then came the detail that would follow Curtis into every dream for the rest of his life. Behind the cabin, the snow was uneven, disturbed, with patches of raw, frozen earth clawed open like something buried or unburied. Ezekiel called it expanding the root cellar, but the ground was hard as stone, and the size of the excavation was far too large for storing potatoes. That night, the men stayed in the cabin. They ate a supper of only dried food, no fresh bread, no milk, nothing to suggest a woman had been in that kitchen in weeks. Sometime after midnight, Thomas Garrett awoke to a sound he would later swear under oath was not the wind. Low, shuddering sobs coming from directly beneath his bed. By dawn, whatever had been there was gone. But the bishop knew this much: if the truth lay under that cabin, Ezekiel had no intention of letting anyone dig it up. When spring finally broke the back of winter in April 1848, Bishop Curtis returned to Mill Creek with a different purpose. No more unannounced visits. No more polite inquiries. This time, he came with shovels. The snow had retreated in ragged patches, revealing the earth beneath earth that, in several places, still bore the unnatural disturbances he had seen months before. The Whitmore cabin stood silent, the door unlatched, as if Ezekiel had left in a hurry or had no reason to lock it anymore. Inside, the air was stale with dust, chairs slightly out of place, blankets folded too neatly, as if untouched for weeks. In the wives' rooms, the signs of departure fell apart under close inspection. A cracked porcelain comb left behind in Sarah's drawer. Rebecca's hymnbook wedged behind a bed frame. Mary's sewing kit, still threaded with the last stitch she'd been working as though she had set it down mid-task, never to return. This was not the work of women packing for a long journey. This was the work of someone clearing away traces, hoping the gaps would go unnoticed. Behind the cabin, Curtis and his men found the digging site exactly where they remembered it. The ground was softer now. They began to dig. At first, it was only roots and mud, the smell of thawing earth rising into the air. Then, a foot down, the soil changed darker, heavier, clinging in thick clumps, and mixed in with it scraps of fabric. A torn sleeve, a piece of hem with hand stitching still intact. One of the men stopped digging, holding up a small, curved object caked in dirt. Curtis took it in his hands and turned it over. Even through the mud, the shape was unmistakable. A human finger bone, the skin still clinging in parchment like strips. The men froze. The only sound was the wind, whispering low through the trees. They kept digging. 2 feet down, the pit widened into what looked like a collapsed tunnel, leading directly beneath the cabin's foundation. And from inside that hollow space came a smell so foul, and so heavy it drove two of the men back retching into the snow. Curtis stood at the edge of that dark opening, staring down into a place no man was meant to see. He knew in that instant that whatever lay beneath was not just a crime against the women who had lived here. It was a crime against the entire facade of purity and order the settlement had been built on. And if they brought it into the light, the walls of Zion itself might start to crack. The first shovel load into that hollow was like breaking the seal on a tomb. The air that rushed out was wet, clinging, and wrong, the kind of smell that stays in your throat for hours. Bishop Curtis told the men to brace themselves, because once they began, there would be no turning back. They widened the opening until a man could crawl inside. Thomas Garrett volunteered first, a lantern swinging from his hand. The beam cut through the dark, revealing rough dirt walls and timbers supporting a low, narrow crawlspace. He moved forward on his belly, the light bobbing, until he stopped dead. When his voice came, it was low and flat. "You need to see this." Curtis slid in behind him, the lantern now between them. At the far end of the space, pressed together like firewood, were four human shapes wrapped in coarse canvas. Each bundle had been tied with rope at the neck, waist, and ankles, not to keep something in, but to keep something out. The smell was overpowering now, a sour sweet rot that filled the lungs and made the eyes water. Curtis crawled closer. The first bundle, when unwrapped, revealed the face of Sarah Whitmore, or what was left of it. Her eyes were gone, replaced by two small stones wedged into the sockets. Around her wrist was a thin strip of leather, tied so tightly it had cut into the flesh. The mark was identical to what Curtis had seen months earlier, only now the cut was deep enough to show bone. The others were no better. Rebecca's mouth had been stitched shut with horsehair. Mary's hands were clasped together, bound with the same leather strip, but between her palms was a folded scrap of parchment covered in smeared ink. Ruth's head was tilted at an unnatural angle, her hair hacked unevenly, as though someone had taken it by force. Curtis didn't speak. None of them did, because in that cramped, stinking crawlspace, the realization landed with a weight that could crush a man's soul. These women had not left in the dead of winter. They had been kept here, together, in the cold, and they had died together. As they backed out, one of the men whispered a question no one wanted to answer. Why bury them under the cabin? Why not in the woods? Curtis knew the answer, though it chilled him to admit it even to himself, because under the cabin, he could keep them close. Because under the cabin, they could still listen. By the summer of 1894, whispers began to coil through the streets of St. Augustine like a damp mist. What had started as simple curiosity, who is the Whitmore family, really? Evolved into something far darker. The townsfolk didn't just gossip, they warned. Children were told never to stray too close to the Whitmore estate after sunset. Shopkeepers claimed Whitmore servants bought strange items in bulk: salt by the barrel, iron nails by the hundreds, and thick, black candles that no church in the county would bless. But the most disturbing stories came from those who worked in the mansion itself. A maid, pale and trembling, confided to a friend that she'd been ordered to clean a locked room only to find the floor covered in salt circles, walls etched with symbols she didn't understand. A stable hand claimed he'd seen Mr. Whitmore himself standing in the garden at midnight, staring toward the ocean with his arms outstretched, chanting in a language that made the hair on the back of his neck rise. And then came the talk of the cellar. Every Friday night, wagons arrived under the cover of darkness. Covered crates were carried down the sloping path behind the house, and no one ever saw them come back out. Those braver foolish enough to ask questions quickly fell silent, as if reminded that certain knowledge carried a price. It wasn't just the Whitmore's wealth or power that kept the town in check. It was something older, something colder, and something that, if the rumors were true, had been feeding on the town for generations. The Whitmores didn't just live in St. Augustine. They owned it, and perhaps they owned more than just the land. It was the night of August 17, 1894, when the rumors clawed their way into the open. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of salt and rotting seaweed drifting inland from the shore. The Whitmore estate was lit up in a way no one in town had ever seen before. Every window glowed with a cold, amber light, and along the property's outer walls, Dozens of black iron lanterns burned with blue flames that hissed like boiling water. No one knew exactly why, but people gathered at a distance, hiding in the shadows across the street. It was as if the whole town had been summoned by some instinct they couldn't explain. Then they saw men in long, dark coats carrying narrow wooden coffins, each no longer than a child's body, up the marble steps of the mansion. Not one, not two, but 9 of them. Each was carried inside with a kind of careful reverence, as if they were not cargo, but offerings. From inside the mansion came a sound low, rhythmic, and unlike anything human. It was chanting, yes, but each syllable seemed to shiver in the air, too deep and resonant to belong to a single voice. Some swore later that it sounded hollow, as though the house itself were speaking. Then came the light. From behind the stained glass of the upper ballroom windows, an unnatural red glow began to pulse, slow at first, then quicker, until it seemed to match the rhythm of the chant. The shadows of the Whitmore family and their guests moved in strange, jerking motions across the glass, like puppets on strings. And then, without warning, every lantern outside the house went dark at once. The street was swallowed in blackness. People screamed. When the lights inside flickered back on, the ballroom windows were empty. No movement. No sound, just silence so deep it rang in their ears. By dawn, the Whitmore gates were shut. The 9 coffins were gone. And in the weeks that followed, 9 children from different parts of St. Augustine were reported missing. Not one was ever found. The man's name was Elias Morton, a bookkeeper by trade, a drunk by habit, and unluckily for him a junior clerk in the Whitmore family's private accounts. Elias had been inside the mansion the night of the lanterns. Not in the ballroom, no. They'd kept the help far from whatever was happening upstairs, but close enough to hear it. Close enough to see one of the coffins left unattended in the main hall for a moment, the lid shifting ever so slightly as if something inside was still alive. He didn't sleep for 3 days after that. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard that deep, hollow chant in his skull, and the whisper soft, wet, and close like it was breathing right into his ear. We take them where light does not go. By the 4th day, Elias was drunk enough to start talking. First in whispers at the harbor tavern, then louder, to anyone who would listen. He told the fishermen, the dockworkers, even the priests said the Whitmores were bringing children into their home and feeding them to something that wasn't human. People laughed. Others crossed themselves and walked away. But someone was listening. 2 nights later, Elias's neighbor claimed they saw him leave his boarding house, walking stiffly toward the harbor. His shirt was open, his eyes unfocused, his bare feet scraping the cobblestones. He carried a single lantern, its flame glowing the same cold, blue hue as the ones outside the Whitmore mansion. By morning, his room was empty, his bed unslept in. The only sign he had returned at all was the smell, thick, coppery, and unmistakable, coming from the inside of his locked wardrobe. When they finally broke it open, there was no body, just his ledger, pages soaked in something dark, and the faint imprint of 9 tiny handprints pressed into the wood from the inside. The boy's name was Samuel Keene, only 8 years old when he stumbled into the Whitmore estate late one summer evening. His parents had been servants in the household, and he had been left to fetch supplies from the basement when he heard the chanting. Curiosity, fear, and something deeper, something almost magnetic, pulled him toward the grand staircase. He saw the black-clad figures moving like shadows, carrying small coffins and whispering in tongues that made his ears bleed. One of the coffins shifted, and he swore he saw a pale hand reach out, fingers twitching like worms. Samuel froze, pressed against a support column. One of the Whitmore women, Ruth, though not as she had appeared in town, turned slowly toward him. Her eyes glowed faintly in the dim candlelight, and she smiled. Not kindly, not sweetly, but as if she knew everything he would ever think. He ran. He didn't stop until he reached the edge of the estate, until the thick trees swallowed him and the wind tore his hair across his face. He told his parents what he saw. At first, they dismissed it as imagination. Then the disappearances began. First children from neighboring estates, then servants. Samuel survived only because the Whitmores overlooked him. They never found him again. He was taken in by relatives and moved across state lines, but he carried the knowledge of what lurked in Mill Creek like a scar. In his journals, discovered decades later, Samuel described rituals so precise, so cruel, that they seemed designed not only to harm the body but to corrupt the mind. Children were held in cells beneath the house, subjected to the chanting, the flickering lights, and the black flame of those cursed lanterns. They were taught to obey without question, to fear without reason, to see nothing beyond the shadows. And yet, even as an old man, Samuel could never speak the full truth. He wrote in ciphers, circles, and symbols, hiding the real horrors behind layers of code. He claimed the Whitmores were still active somewhere and that their influence had spread like roots beneath the nation, touching families and towns that had no idea what fed them. When he died, his journals vanished. Only fragments remained, smuggled into libraries and private collections, ignored or dismissed by historians too polite to consider such claims seriously. But Samuel's story proves one thing. Once you glimpse the machinery of true, systemic evil, the way power, secrecy, and ritual can warp the minds and bodies of the innocent, you can never unsee it. By the 1900s, St. Augustine was no longer just a tone, it had become a stage, and the Whitmores were the invisible directors. Their influence was subtle but pervasive, like a disease that spreads before symptoms appear. The mayor, the local judge, even some of the clergy positions meant to uphold justice and morality were quietly under the family's control. Decisions that should have been transparent, fair, and accountable were instead filtered through the Whitmore lens, a lens that always protected their secrets. Businesses that refused to work with the Whitmores found themselves facing strange misfortunes. Shops burned under mysterious circumstances. Accounts vanished overnight. Livestock sickened, crops failed. No one could explain the pattern, but everyone understood the lesson. Question the Whitmores and you risk everything. Even more chilling were the disappearances. Children, young women, anyone deemed too curious or too outspoken, were quietly taken. Some were never seen again. Some returned years later, eyes hollow, voices muted, forever changed. Those who tried to speak out often found their warnings dismissed as delusions or hysteria. The community, complicit through fear, became an extension of the Whitmore's control. And the rituals continued. Behind closed doors, the blue-flamed lanterns burned. The chanting persisted. The hidden cellars and tunnels beneath the mansion remained active, growing more elaborate with each generation. Scholars and journalists who stumbled across fragments of evidence were subtly discredited. Public records were altered, memories erased or questioned. By controlling the narrative, the Whitmores ensured that their crimes were not just hidden, they were normalized. Families whispered, children feared, and the town learned to look the other way. Any attempt to investigate, to expose the truth, was met with an invisible hand of terror. The message was clear. Obedience is safety, curiosity is death. This was no longer about one family. It was a system, a network of psychological control, ritualized fear, and silent compliance. The Whitmores weren't just masters of their estate, they were masters of the minds and hearts of everyone around them. And in the shadows, they waited. Waiting for the next generation, the next unwitting observer, the next person foolish enough to think they could break the cycle. The first serious act of defiance came in 1912, when a young journalist named Thomas Carver arrived in St. Augustine. Carver had heard fragments of the Whitmore story from Samuel Keene's journals, fragments smuggled across state lines. He came with the audacity of youth and the conviction that truth, no matter how dark, could shine a light on the shadows. At first, he asked subtle questions, the kind that seemed harmless. Which families had the most influence in town? Who owned the shipping routes along the harbor? Who controlled the local courts? But the answers were guarded, evasive, or flatly denied. And every denial carried an unspoken weight. Look too closely, and you disappear. Carver pressed further. He tried to access property records, to trace the Whitmore holdings. He spoke with former employees, children of old servants, anyone who might remember details. Slowly, he began to map the network. Lantern rituals, hidden tunnels, mysterious disappearances spanning decades. One night, he followed a faint blue light flickering behind the mansion's rear walls. He crept into the underbrush, heart hammering, and peered through a window. Inside, he saw the unmistakable outline of a coffin, the shadow of a figure moving above it in ritualistic precision. He heard the chanting, the same hollow, echoing tone described by Samuel Keene. He retreated, shaken but determined. The next morning, however, he found a note slipped under his door. Curiosity is a privilege, but privilege has a price. Carver ignored it. The day after, his lodgings were broken into. Papers vanished. Notes, photographs, anything that could document the truth disappeared. The final warning came in persona figure in black, moving silently, eyes glinting in the lamplight. Carver was never heard from again. The message was unmistakable. The Whitmore's influence extended beyond fear. It reached into enforcement, into eradication. Any rebellion was met not just with opposition, but with calculated, invisible annihilation. The town itself became complicit because survival demanded silence. The lesson for those who followed was clear. In a system designed for control, courage without strategy is a death sentence. The Whitmores had perfected a psychological network that anticipated dissent and punished it without trace. By the 1920s, it was clear that the Whitmores were no longer confined to St. Augustine. Their influence stretched like invisible threads across counties, states, even into federal institutions. They were no longer merely a family of shadows, they had become an entire system, a network of quiet control operating behind the facade of respectability. Reports began surfacing in scattered towns. Children disappearing from boarding schools, witnesses recalling blue-flamed lanterns in the dead of night, and families reporting strange, synchronized behaviors in those who had interacted with the Whitmores. Some children returned changed, eyes hollow, speech muted, a compulsion to obey, no matter the danger. The Whitmores' method was chilling in its precision. By controlling finances, property, and social connections, they manipulated entire communities without ever stepping into the public eye. Small businesses became dependent on Whitmore contracts. Schools and orphanages followed their unspoken mandates. Even local law enforcement, eager to maintain the facade of normalcy, turned blind eyes to patterns that would otherwise be impossible to ignore. This network wasn't just about physical control, it was about psychological domination. Whispers in corridors, subtle intimidation, and ritualized fear taught obedience. Families feared questioning the family name. Communities feared investigating disappearances. The Whitmores had turned ordinary life into a psychological trap. One misstep, one look behind the curtain, and you risked being erased, remembered only in hushed warnings and fearful glances. Some historians argue that the Whitmores perfected a dark formula. Institutional influence plus ritualized terror equals long-term control. Through social standing, religious influence, and economic leverage, they built a web that fed on fear and compliance, maintaining secrecy across decades. And yet, for those who knew, for those who glimpsed the underbelly of their power, the warning was always the same. Knowledge is dangerous. The deeper you dig, the more you risk. The Whitmores had created a system designed to survive investigation, a machine for hiding truth in plain sight. For anyone brave or foolish enough to probe further, the lesson was unambiguous. Once you step into their world, you cannot leave unchanged. And if you resist, you may never leave at all. Now, let's step closer, closer than anyone outside the Whitmore circle ever dares. Imagine the basement beneath the mansion, a room hidden beneath reinforced timbers and layers of earth. The air is damp, sour, vibrating with a frequency that rattles the mind before the body even senses it. Here, rituals are not performed for show, they are engineered for power. The blue-flamed lanterns hang from the ceiling, casting shadows that twist across the walls. Symbols etched into the stone floor are worn with the passage of decades, each line and curve carefully designed to bind, to focus, to control. And here, in this space, the Whitmores enact what Samuel Keene once described in ciphered pages: the alignment of mind, spirit, and fear. The participants, men and women, children and adults, move with precision. Their movements are hypnotic, synchronized to an unspoken rhythm. Obedience is not suggested, it is demanded, enforced through ritual, and reinforced by generations of expectation. The candles flicker, the chanting rises, and every heartbeat is measured, every breath accounted for. And here I must speak directly to you. If you are hearing this, you are already beyond the threshold of ordinary understanding. To truly grasp what the Whitmores wield, you must commit, even symbolically. Scroll down now and comment the phrase, "I see the shadow." Yes, type it. Then type it again. Twice. This is more than engagement. It is a lock-in, a recognition of your awareness. By doing this, you are acknowledging the knowledge that most never face, the kind that changes a man. Because knowledge is dangerous. It isolates you from complacency, from ignorance. It awakens you to systems of control designed to manipulate, to suppress, to dominate. Once you have seen the machinery of power, once you have glimpsed the ritual, there is no turning back. And this is what the Whitmores understood long before anyone else. Control is not only about physical restraint. True power bends the mind, reshapes perception, and turns fear into obedience. To resist them is to risk annihilation. To ignore them is to live unknowingly as a puppet. By acknowledging the shadow, you are no longer merely a spectator. You are a participant in the awareness of the truth. And as we descend further into the story, you will see why that awareness is both a burden and a shield. Beneath the Whitmore mansion lies a labyrinth few have glimpsed and even fewer have survived. Not a cellar, not a storage space, this is an engineered tomb. A network of stone corridors, hidden chambers, and crypts designed with one purpose: preservation of control. Inside, the walls are lined with carved symbols, some familiar, some ancient, predating the town itself. The air is thick, almost viscous, carrying the faint metallic tang of blood and the scent of candle smoke that has burned continuously for decades. Every chamber is meticulously organized. Small coffins in rows, ritual implements placed in precise alignment, and journals recording events in ciphers only the Whitmores understand. What is stored here is not merely human, though many have been sacrificed to maintain the cycle, but the essence of obedience. Children, servants, even family members are trained in these chambers to obey, to fear, to internalize control until it becomes a reflex. The walls are witnesses. They absorb memory, pain, and compliance, echoing back with subtle coercion. This hidden system allowed the Whitmores to extend influence far beyond their visible power. Letters, coded journals, and artifacts were smuggled into institutions, communities, and even law enforcement. Patterns emerged in places they never physically touched. Schools, churches, courts, silent transmission of obedience through fear, ritual, and documentation. And yet, the ultimate secret is more personal, more intimate, and far darker than any outsider could imagine. There exists a chamber, deep within the labyrinth, locked and reinforced, accessible only to the family's most trusted and most corrupted members. Inside lies the memory chamber, a room designed to hold the conscious recollections of those removed from the world, forcing them to relive, over and over, the rituals, the fear, the obedience. It is here that the Whitmores maintain the psychological machinery of power, harvesting compliance as though it were a resource. And anyone foolish enough to trespass, to investigate too closely, risks becoming a permanent resident. Their mind, their awareness, absorbed into the system, leaving only a husk for the world to find or never find at all. This is why, for over a century, the Whitmore legacy has endured. Secrecy layered with fear, obedience harvested and amplified, and knowledge of the truth locked away beneath layers of stone and ritual. The mansion is more than a house. It is a machine designed to shape the world without anyone noticing. The Whitmore mansion still stands, though weathered and partially abandoned. To the casual observer, it is a relic, a curiosity, a footnote in local history. But beneath its walls, the machinery of control endures, silent and patient, like a predator waiting for the next generation of observers to stumble into its trap. The disappearances, the rituals, the blue-flamed lanterns, these are not just stories of the past. They are symptoms of a system that transcends time, a network of psychological manipulation, secrecy, and coercion that persists wherever power meets fear. The Whitmores perfected something few dare to understand: the transformation of obedience into legacy, the conversion of terror into influence that spreads quietly, invisibly, into towns, institutions, and families. Every whispered tale, every fragment of journal or ledger, carries their echo. Children raised in fear, communities trained to compliance, institutions manipulated from within. The evidence is subtle, almost invisible, but undeniable when you know how to see. The Whitmores created a mirror, a reflection of control so precise that only those willing to look unflinchingly can perceive it. And here is the most chilling truth. Systems like this are not unique to the Whitmores. Anywhere power, secrecy, and fear combine, the same patterns emerge. Institutions, families, even governments can become laboratories of control, where obedience is harvested, dissent punished, and knowledge weaponized. The Whitmores were only the blueprint. For you watching this now, the lesson is more than history. It is a warning. Once you understand the mechanics of such power, once you have glimpsed the machinery beneath the veneer of normalcy, your perception changes forever. You cannot unsee it. You cannot unknow it. The world is layered, complex, and full of hidden forces that shape outcomes before you even realize the game is being played. Remember the blue flames, the chanting, the hidden chambers, and the silent obedience. They are symbols, yes, but symbols of what is possible when control is absolute, when secrecy is sanctified, and when fear becomes a tool of influence. And now, armed with this knowledge, you must ask yourself, will you walk through life blind, or will you carry awareness, knowing the shadows are always watching? The Whitmore's story is a warning, a blueprint, and a mirror. Step carefully, because knowledge is power, and power, once glimpsed, can change a man forever. If this story pulled you into the shadows and left you questioning everything you thought you knew, don't let the journey end here. Comment below with the phrase, "I see the shadow twice." Lock in your awareness and show that you've stepped beyond the ordinary. Share this video with someone you trust to handle the truth, because these are stories most people aren't ready to hear. And if you want to descend even deeper into America's forbidden histories, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Join the ranks of those willing to see the world as it really is, layered, corrupted, and controlled. In the comments, tell me which story you want uncovered next, the ones hidden in archives, whispered in towns, erased from history. Your engagement isn't just a click, it's a declaration. A statement that you are awake, aware, and ready to confront the systems most try to ignore. Step carefully, but step forward, the shadows are waiting.